Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. After hours of winding roads through dense, towering trees, we finally arrived at a secluded wooden lodge nestled by the edge of a calm, still lake. I felt the tension easing as I stepped out of the car, stretching stiff muscles and inhaling the earthy scent of pine and wet leaves. The anticipation of a quiet, peaceful weekend was a relief after the city noise, a retreat I hadn't even realized I needed. While my parents handled the check-in, I wandered a few steps toward the lake, letting the silence settle around me. Just as I was getting lost in the tranquility, a firm grip suddenly clamped down on my shoulder. I froze, heart jumping to my throat, and twisted around. My stepbrother stood there, his face drawn and serious, with an expression I hadn't seen before. The casual, easygoing attitude I'd come to associate with him was nowhere to be found. "What are we doing here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His fingers were tense on my shoulder, as though his question held more weight than the words themselves. I pulled back, taken aback. "What do you mean?" I replied, trying to brush off the weird vibe. "It's just a family trip." He glanced around, the familiar face now seeming distant, almost unrecognizable. "Yeah, maybe," he muttered, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. His grip loosened and he let his hand drop. I was about to press him, ask what he was talking about, when our parents' voices broke the tension, calling us from the lodge door. I glanced back at my stepbrother, but he had already shifted back to his usual self, shrugging off the moment as if it had never happened. Our parents, meanwhile, seemed blissfully unaware of the strange tension between us. They stood by the lodge entrance, grinning with the excitement of a couple of kids. "There's been a little mix-up," my mom explained, not seeming too bothered. "Turns out they only have 2 rooms ready, so you'll have to share one tonight." Her words sank in slowly. A strange discomfort crept into me, but I forced myself to keep a neutral expression. Sharing a room with him wasn't a big deal. We'd known each other for years, and he'd always been around like family. But as we walked toward our shared room, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my chest. The room was tiny, with 2 small beds crammed along the walls, their covers neatly tucked and smelling faintly of detergent. Outside the small window, the sun was dipping low, casting a warm, golden glow over the trees. I dropped my bag on the bed nearest to the window, glancing over at him. He looked relaxed again, back to his casual, indifferent self, and it almost made me doubt the strange tension from earlier. As I unpacked my things, I tried to settle my mind, reminding myself that I was just tired from the drive, but no matter how I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't quite forget the way he'd looked at me by the lake. I focused on getting ready for dinner, folding away the clothes I'd need for tomorrow, and putting away my charger and book. The familiar rhythm of organizing my things usually calmed me down, but not tonight. My gaze drifted to him again, catching his reflection in the mirror. He was watching me, a distant, thoughtful look in his eyes that felt both familiar and foreign. "What?" I asked, breaking the silence that hung between us. He hesitated, as though choosing his words carefully. "Nothing," he finally said, shaking his head. "I was just thinking about something." I didn't press further, sensing that whatever was bothering him, he wasn't ready to talk about it. Dinner was approaching, and I knew our parents would be expecting us. So I grabbed my jacket and gestured toward the door. "Let's go, they'll think we're hiding up here." He followed without another word, and we walked down to the lodge's small dining area, where our parents were already settled at a table, deep in conversation. They waved us over, cheerful, unaware of the strange undercurrent that seemed to have followed us all the way here. As we ate, I tried to lose myself in the meal, focusing on my parents' lively chatter about the weekend plans, hiking, canoeing on the lake, maybe even a small-town visit. I nodded along, agreeing that it all sounded great, but my mind kept drifting back to the encounter by the lake and the lingering strangeness of it all. Later, back in our shared room, the atmosphere remained thick and unspoken. I picked up my book, pretending to read, though the words on the page blurred together. The walls of the room seemed to close in, making the small space feel even more cramped. Just as I was thinking about turning out the light, he looked over at me. "Does it feel weird to you?" he asked abruptly. His question threw me off. "Weird?" "Being here," he clarified, leaning back against the headboard, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls. "Like, everything's just a little off." I didn't answer immediately, my mind racing with too many half-formed thoughts. But he didn't seem to need a response. After a moment, he lay back, staring at the ceiling, his face now unreadable. The quiet settled heavily in the room, and I could hear each tick of the clock on the wall, counting down the seconds. He lay on his bed, eyes closed, looking like he'd finally given in to sleep. I wished I could do the same. I shifted under the blanket, trying to find a comfortable position, but the air felt thick and close, as if it was holding something unsaid. Every time I tried to close my eyes, my mind replayed the strange day, his grip on my shoulder by the lake, the question he'd asked, his face in the mirror. All of it unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. Minutes felt like hours. I couldn't take it anymore. With a quiet sigh, I pushed the blanket back and sat up, hugging my knees and staring out the small window. The moon cast pale light over the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a faint rustling could be heard. This place, usually peaceful, now felt isolating, like we were in a world apart, cut off from everything familiar. "You can't sleep either?" His voice broke the silence, so sudden it made me jump. I turned to find him sitting up, his eyes half-lidded but alert. He looked at me with an intensity that felt as if he could see right through me. "No," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Too much on my mind, I guess." He smiled slightly, a faint, tired expression. "Me too." There was a long pause. Then, almost as if it was an afterthought, he added, "Maybe it's this place, or just everything lately." "Yeah, maybe." I glanced away, feeling the tension creep back, coiling in the pit of my stomach. I was sure I'd regret this, but I spoke before I could stop myself. "Do you remember earlier, by the lake, what you said?" He didn't respond immediately, just looked down at his hands, as if weighing his answer. "Yeah, I do. Sorry if I made things weird." His voice was quiet, almost cautious, as though he was afraid to say too much. I wanted to say it was fine, to brush it off and move past it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, silence settled over us again, heavy and charged. I had the urge to get up, leave the room, do anything to break whatever was happening here. But I couldn't move. Then he spoke again, his voice softer, almost hesitant. "I don't know what's going on with us. It's hard to explain. I keep thinking about things I shouldn't, and I can't stop it. Maybe it's being here, or maybe it's something else. Do you feel it too?" His words hung in the air, suspended, impossible to ignore. I felt my throat tighten, 100 different responses tangling together. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, not trusting my voice. His eyes found mine, and we sat there, frozen in the quiet, an unspoken understanding passing between us. There was something there, something we both felt but neither of us could name. For a moment I thought he might say something else, break the silence with words that could unravel the tension. But he didn't. Instead, he moved closer, his expression unreadable, as if he was searching for an answer in my face. The space between us seemed to shrink, and I couldn't look away. My heart pounded, louder than the quiet around us, filling the silence with a rhythm that felt both thrilling and terrifying. And then, without thinking, I leaned forward. It was a brief, fleeting kiss, one that seemed to hang in the air long after it ended. He pulled back first, his eyes wide, as if he was just as shocked as I was. For a second, we just stared at each other, words failing both of us. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. Relief? Regret? The lines between them blurred. His voice broke the silence, a half-choked whisper. "We can't, right?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was reeling, searching for something solid to cling to. But everything felt uncertain, unsteady, like we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't pull back from. I don't know, I finally whispered, my voice barely audible. The truth was, I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that something had shifted, something I couldn't take back. For a while, we just sat there, each of us lost in our own thoughts, the weight of what had happened pressing down on us. I could feel my pulse still racing, the lingering warmth of that moment refusing to fade. We were caught in the silence, in the aftermath of something we both felt but couldn't explain. Eventually, he stood up, moving toward the door. He hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the handle, and glanced back at me. There was something unreadable in his expression, a mix of emotions that I couldn't quite place. "Maybe we should try to get some sleep," he murmured, almost as if he was talking to himself. I nodded, though I knew sleep was the last thing I'd find tonight. He stepped out of the room, leaving me alone with the echo of everything that had happened. The silence settled around me once more, but it was different now, charged with something that I couldn't ignore. I lay back down, pulling the blanket over me, though I didn't feel the comfort it usually brought. I closed my eyes, hoping to find some escape in the darkness. But the memory of that moment lingered, vivid and undeniable. There was no going back to what things had been before. The next morning, the air felt thick with unspoken words. I hadn't managed to sleep, and judging by the silence coming from his bed, neither had he. The early sun was filtering through the trees outside our window, casting soft shadows across the walls. I got dressed quickly, slipping on my jacket and sneakers, eager to escape the room, if only for a little while. Maybe the lake would offer some kind of clarity, I thought, though I knew that was probably wishful thinking. I made my way downstairs to find my parents already having coffee on the small patio outside. The cheerful morning sounds and the rich aroma of coffee usually would have lifted my spirits, but today they barely registered. My mom looked up and smiled, oblivious to the restless night I'd had. "Morning. Did you get any sleep?" she asked, her voice light and full of that parental optimism. I forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, a little," I replied, though my voice came out strained. My dad, engrossed in a newspaper, only looked up briefly to give me a nod. I was relieved they didn't ask more. It was as if just being there with them would somehow shake off the memories of the previous night. I was about to excuse myself to go for a walk when he appeared behind me. I felt him before I even turned around. That unsettling awareness that seemed to come with his presence now. He greeted our parents with a casual "good morning" and took a seat right across from me. I avoided his gaze, staring intently at my coffee cup, as if it held all the answers. My mom beamed. "So, what's the plan today? It's a beautiful day. We should go check out that town by the lake, maybe rent a boat later?" I nodded, grateful for any distraction, but I could feel his gaze on me, silent and steady. He was acting as if nothing had happened, and I almost envied him for it. Or maybe he was just better at hiding it. Either way, I wasn't going to let it show, especially not in front of our parents. We spent the morning driving through winding roads, the trees thick and lush on either side of the narrow paths. My mom chatted animatedly, pointing out landmarks and making small plans. Occasionally my dad would chuckle, shaking his head as she suggested we all take a canoe out onto the lake. "Come on," she urged, her enthusiasm infectious. "We're here to relax, right?" Her excitement was contagious, but every time I glanced at him, I was reminded of that invisible line we'd crossed. The morning passed in a strange blur, with everyone seeming perfectly at ease except for me. I tried to lose myself in the scenery, the familiar comfort of my parents' chatter, anything that could ground me. Eventually, we reached a small village nestled on the shore of a pristine lake. It looked like something out of a painting, with colorful houses dotting the hills and small boats gently rocking in the water. As we walked through the narrow streets, I could almost forget everything, lose myself in the charming atmosphere. My mom dragged me to a small shop filled with handmade crafts, and for a while it was just us. It felt good to be alone with her, to feel that steady, comforting presence that only a parent could provide. "Isn't this beautiful?" she said, holding up a hand-painted ceramic bowl. She looked at me, her eyes warm. "We could bring something back as a memory of this trip." I nodded, smiling. "Yeah, it's nice." But as we continued exploring, The weight of the previous night crept back in, unshakable. I glanced back to find him standing by the water, his hands in his pockets, staring off into the distance. There was something vulnerable in his stance, a quiet tension that pulled at me. I quickly looked away, hoping he hadn't noticed. After a few hours, my parents decided to get lunch at a small cafe by the lake. I offered to stay behind, saying I'd take some pictures around the village. My mom seemed hesitant at first, but she relented, leaving me with a quick hug and a reminder to meet them back soon. I watched as they walked away, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. I wandered down toward the water, letting the cool breeze clear my mind. Just as I was starting to feel a sense of calm, he appeared beside me, his footsteps barely making a sound on the gravel path. We stood there in silence, looking out at the lake, the quiet stretching between us, heavy and full of things we couldn't say. "You don't have to avoid me," he finally said, his voice low. There was a hint of frustration there, a flicker of something unresolved. "I'm not avoiding you," I replied, though it sounded weak even to me. I couldn't meet his eyes, afraid of what I'd see there. The lake was so still, its surface unbroken, like it was mirroring my attempt to keep things calm, untouched. "Look, about last night." He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "It was a mistake. We were tired, maybe a little out of it. This place, it does strange things to people." He sounded almost desperate to rationalize it, to put a label on whatever was happening between us. I wanted to believe him, wanted to pretend it was all just a passing moment, something that didn't mean anything. "Yeah," I agreed, though the word felt hollow. "It was just a mistake." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The tension, the awareness, it was all still there, hanging in the air between us. I could feel it like a weight, something neither of us could shake off. He looked at me, his expression guarded, yet there was a flicker of something deeper, something I couldn't ignore. Without thinking, I reached for his hand, a brief, instinctive movement. He didn't pull away, and for a second we stood there, holding on to something fragile, something neither of us could name. The moment stretched on, and I knew we were skirting the edge of something we couldn't come back from. But then, just as quickly, I pulled my hand back, feeling a rush of confusion and guilt. He gave me a small, sad smile, as if he understood. "I guess we should head back," I said, my voice barely audible. "Yeah," he replied, his tone resigned, like he was letting go of something he couldn't hold on to. As we walked back, the silence between us felt different, weighted with things left unsaid, leaving me with a sense of finality that I didn't understand. And as we rejoined my parents at the cafe, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. The evening air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and pine as we gathered around the fire my parents had started near the shore. Shadows danced across the trees as flames licked the night sky, casting a warm glow that made the world feel smaller, more intimate. My parents sat on a log, laughing quietly, wrapped in their own contentment. Meanwhile, I felt like a ghost, both present and absent, my mind circling back to the unresolved tension from earlier that day. I took a seat on the edge of a large rock a bit further from the fire, hoping the distance might help me gather myself. But he didn't give me the space I was seeking. He sat down next to me, his presence impossible to ignore, and for a few moments, neither of us spoke. We watched the fire, both lost in thought, the only sounds the crackling of burning wood and the occasional laughter from my parents. Finally, breaking the silence, he leaned closer and murmured, "It feels like we're the only two people here." The remark sent a shiver down my spine, and I forced a laugh, attempting to brush it off. I mean, there's literally no one else around for miles. I tried to sound casual, but even I could hear the strain in my voice. He shook his head slightly, giving me a look that cut right through the flimsy pretense. "You know what I mean?" I couldn't meet his gaze, feeling the familiar knot of tension tighten in my chest. Part of me wanted to confront him, to finally get answers, but I couldn't summon the courage. Instead, I looked down, tracing patterns in the dirt with the tip of my shoe, anything to avoid the intensity in his eyes. "Why do you keep doing this?" I whispered, barely audible. "Doing what?" he asked, his voice gentle but searching, acting like there's something here. I gestured vaguely between us, struggling to find the right words. "It's confusing. It doesn't make any sense." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at me with that same unreadable expression, like he was weighing his response, holding back something he couldn't say. Finally, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine, his fingers hesitant, like he was testing the boundaries. "It doesn't have to make sense," he said quietly. "Some things just are." His words hung in the air, and I felt a strange pull, something magnetic that defied all reason. Before I knew it, his hand had settled over mine, and we both sat there, frozen in the moment, each of us unwilling to be the one to pull away. The world around us seemed to fade, the warmth of his hand the only thing grounding me in reality. Suddenly, my mom's voice broke the silence, calling us over to help with the marshmallows. We both pulled back, hands falling to our sides, the spell shattered. I turned quickly, hoping she hadn't noticed anything unusual. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the warmth still lingering on my skin where his hand had been. As we joined my parents around the fire, the ease with which they joked and chatted seemed to magnify the weight of the unspoken between us. I tried to act natural, smiling and laughing along with them, but I could feel his gaze on me, a steady reminder of the growing rift between what I was trying to project and what I actually felt. When the fire finally burned low and the night was settling in deeper, my parents decided to head back to the cabin, leaving us to put out the last of the embers. I stayed by the fire, watching the glowing coals flicker and dim, pretending to be engrossed in the task of burying the embers with sand. He was still standing there, just behind me, watching me in silence. Once we were alone again, he stepped closer, and I felt his presence like a shadow, unsettling and persistent. "Look, about earlier," he started, his voice low. I swallowed hard, unsure if I wanted to hear whatever he was about to say. "Let's just forget it, okay? We can go back to normal." But he shook his head, his gaze unyielding. "I don't think we can, not after everything." He paused, the weight of his words sinking into the quiet night. "And I don't think either of us wants to pretend nothing happened." I took a shaky breath, turning to face him. "But it has to be this way. We're just stuck here for a while. This can't be real." His expression softened, a flicker of something vulnerable crossing his face. "And what if it is real? What if we've just been ignoring it?" I couldn't answer. The question hung heavy between us, the truth too complicated, too frightening to confront. He took a step closer, closing the space between us, and my heart was racing again, that familiar mixture of fear and anticipation flooding through me. Then, without warning, he leaned in, and our lips met in a second kiss, this one softer, as if he were trying to communicate something words couldn't capture. It lasted only a moment, yet it felt like everything I'd been trying to ignore had come to the surface in that instant. My mind was spinning, lost between what I thought I knew and what I felt in that brief connection. He pulled back, his expression uncertain, searching my face for a reaction. For a long second, we just looked at each other, the gravity of what had just happened sinking in. The silence grew heavy, and I struggled to find words, anything that could make sense of the mess we'd just created. We can't keep doing this," I managed, my voice trembling. He nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "I know, but it doesn't change how I feel." The words were barely more than a whisper, but they landed with the weight of something inevitable, something I wasn't sure either of us could stop. We stood there, staring at each other in the quiet night, the campfire's final embers casting a faint glow between us. The forest around us seemed to close in, holding our secrets tight, leaving us in a world that felt suspended, caught between past and present, between what was and what could never be. "Let's just go back," I whispered finally, my voice hollow. "Please," he nodded, though he lingered for a moment, his gaze holding mine, as if he was searching for something I wasn't ready to give. Then, finally, he stepped back, and the distance felt both a relief and a loss. Without another word, we walked back to the cabin, the unspoken stretching between us like a fragile thread, something that could snap at any moment. As we slipped inside, the quiet of the cabin felt heavier than the night air, filled with all the things we hadn't said, the things we couldn't say. He headed toward his room without looking back, and I stood there alone, watching him go, feeling as though something had been left unsaid, unfinished, a weight that would linger long after we'd both gone to sleep. Lying in bed that night, the silence around me was deafening. I could feel the distance growing, a fragile line we'd crossed, and I knew, somehow, that nothing would ever be the same. The next morning was drenched in an uneasy quiet. I woke up feeling hollow, like I'd lost something I couldn't name. Sunlight streamed through the cabin window, but it only highlighted the mess in my mind. Fragments of last night flashing in and out. The touch of his hand, his words, that kiss. Each memory left a mark, impossible to shake. I knew that I had to find a way to move past this, to put some distance between us, but the realization made my stomach twist. He was already up when I left my room, sitting at the small dining table, staring out the window at the morning mist that hovered over the lake. For a second, he looked like he was a part of the scene, his presence blending into the quiet. I almost turned around to avoid him, but he looked up before I had the chance, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that I couldn't ignore. "Morning," he said, his voice soft, as though any louder would shatter the fragile silence. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a look of frustration flickering across his face. "But maybe we've been trying so hard to be normal that we're ignoring what's really going on." His words struck a nerve, cutting through the walls I'd built around my emotions. I turned to face him, my heart racing. "And what's really going on?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But I can't just ignore it, and I don't think you can either." The vulnerability in his expression softened something inside me, breaking down the last of my defenses. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel everything I'd been pushing away, the confusion, the attraction, the pull that seemed to bind us together despite everything. But just as quickly, reality reasserted itself, cold and undeniable. I took a step back, shaking my head. "It doesn't matter how we feel," I said softly. "At the end of the day, we're just stuck in a situation neither of us chose. When we go back home, this will all fade. It has to." He looked at me, his expression filled with something close to resignation. "You really believe that?" I didn't answer, couldn't answer. Instead, I turned away, my gaze fixed on the lake, hoping the silence would speak for me. After a few moments, he let out a quiet sigh, a sound filled with acceptance and defeat. "Fine," he said finally. "If that's what you want, then I guess there's nothing left to say." He took a few steps back, creating a distance between us that felt both necessary and painful. We stood there, separated by an invisible barrier, each of us lost in our own thoughts, each of us holding on to unspoken words we could never share. The sound of our parents calling us from down the path broke the silence, and he turned away without another word. I watched him go, a hollow ache settling in my chest, a feeling of finality that was both a relief and a loss. As we rejoined our parents and started the walk back to the cabin, I felt a strange sense of detachment, like I was watching everything from a distance, a spectator to my own life. My mom was chatting happily, oblivious to the tension, and I forced myself to smile, to nod along, pretending to be present even as my mind drifted back to the lake, to the words that lingered there, unspoken and unresolved. When we finally reached the cabin, I busied myself with the final packing, avoiding his gaze, keeping my focus on the task at hand. The ride home was filled with the usual small talk and laughter, my parents recounting memories from the weekend, their voices warm and cheerful. I tried to join in, to match their mood, but each word felt forced, hollow. As we neared the city, my phone buzzed with a new message. I glanced down, my heart skipping a beat when I saw his name. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to open it, But curiosity won, and I tapped the message, holding my breath. I meant everything I said. This doesn't have to be the end. The words stared back at me, each one a reminder of everything I'd tried to leave behind. I felt a surge of emotions: hope, fear, a flicker of something I couldn't name. But as I looked out the window, watching the familiar streets of the city pass by, I knew that reality was waiting, pulling me back to the life I'd left behind. I typed a quick reply, my fingers shaking slightly as I hit send. Let's just give it time. As the message delivered, I closed my eyes, leaning back in my seat, a mixture of relief and uncertainty settling over me. I didn't know what the future held, or if the words we'd shared would fade with time. But for now, I was willing to let go, to leave the rest unspoken, and hope that one day I'd find the answers I was searching for. The city unfolded around us, familiar and unchanged, as if the world had never paused, as if the weekend had been nothing more than a fleeting moment. But somewhere deep inside, I knew that everything was different now, that I was different. And as we drove toward home, I felt a strange sense of both loss and possibility, a reminder that some stories are left unfinished, lingering in the spaces between. I could hear my parents talking in the other room, their laughter muffled but warm, a reminder of everything that was supposed to be simple and right. But my gaze drifted to his door, closed and silent, and I knew that the peace I'd been hoping for wasn't coming anytime soon. Later that night, I heard a soft knock on my door. I didn't answer at first, hoping he might go away, but the knock came again, quiet yet insistent. With a resigned sigh, I stood up and opened the door to find him standing there, his expression a mixture of apology and determination. I needed to talk, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to tell him to leave, to end this here and now, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stepped aside, letting him in, and closed the door behind him. We stood there in the dim light, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between us. I could see the strain in his eyes, the silent plea for understanding, for some kind of resolution. But I didn't know how to give him what he wanted. I didn't know how to fix this. He took a step closer, his gaze locked onto mine, and I felt that same pull, that same unexplainable connection. Part of me wanted to give in, to let go of everything holding me back, but I couldn't. Not here, not like this. I'm sorry, I whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. But it can't keep happening. He nodded, though his face held a trace of sadness, an acceptance tinged with regret. And as he turned to leave, I felt an ache, a hollow feeling that told me things would never truly go back to the way they were. The next morning was drenched in an unbearable silence, a thick, unspoken tension that seemed to cling to the air. I awoke early, hoping to steal a few moments of peace, but the stillness around me only amplified the turmoil inside. I knew he was still here, just one wall away, and the thought made my chest tighten with a mixture of dread and something I couldn't name. I tried to focus on packing my things, folding clothes and organizing them with a mechanical precision, as if the order could somehow calm my chaotic mind. My parents were already up, their voices drifting in from the small living room. They sounded cheerful, unaware of the silent war that had been unfolding in this cabin over the past few days. Eventually, I knew I couldn't avoid everyone forever, so I stepped out of my room, doing my best to look composed. My mom greeted me with a warm smile, her usual enthusiasm undiminished. She immediately launched into plans for the day: one last walk around the lake before we left, a quick stop at a nearby viewpoint on our way home. I forced a smile, nodding along, but my mind was elsewhere, caught between the words I'd left unsaid and the feelings I was trying to bury. Then he walked into the room, and the tension spiked, raw and uncontainable. His eyes flickered toward me, and for a moment, I saw everything he'd been holding back: the confusion, the hurt, the unspoken questions. He looked away quickly, but the damage was done. That brief glance had brought everything back, every unresolved moment between us. I wanted to turn and leave, to find some excuse to escape, but before I could move, my dad clapped his hands, breaking the silence. All right, let's head out. One last walk around the lake, yes? We can't leave without saying goodbye to this beautiful place. Reluctantly, I followed them outside. The morning was cool, a soft mist lingering over the water, giving everything a dreamlike quality. We walked slowly, my parents chatting and laughing as they strolled along the shoreline, oblivious to the silent, awkward distance between us. As we reached the far end of the lake, my mom suggested we each take a few minutes alone to say our own goodbye to this place. She wandered off with my dad, disappearing around a bend in the path, leaving us alone. I could feel his presence beside me, could sense the tension in his stance, but I kept my gaze fixed on the lake, trying to ignore the pull that seemed to draw me closer to him. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. We stood there in silence, the only sounds the gentle lapping of the water and the distant calls of birds hidden in the trees. Finally, he broke the silence. "Are you really going to act like none of this happened?" His voice was low, filled with a quiet frustration that I'd come to recognize. I closed my eyes, gathering my thoughts before I answered. "I'm not acting. I just don't know what else to do. We both agreed this can't continue." "Did we agree, or did you decide that for both of us?" His tone was sharper than I'd expected, and I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me, a mixture of hurt and anger that had been simmering beneath the surface. "I'm trying to make things right," I whispered, my voice barely audible. It isn't normal. We can't keep pretending that it is." "Morning," I replied, and sat down at the other end of the table, hoping the space between us would ease the tension. I reached for a cup of coffee, the warmth comforting against the chill that seemed to settle in my bones. He cleared his throat, glancing down at the table. "About last night. I don't want things to be weird between us." A small, ironic laugh escaped before I could stop it. "I think we're a little past that, don't you?" He winced, as if the words had cut deeper than I intended. I felt a pang of regret, but I didn't know how else to address the mounting pressure between us. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, each of us locked in our own thoughts. I wanted to tell him everything I felt, to let him understand how confused and scared I was, but I couldn't bring myself to start that conversation. Not here, not now. My parents entered the room, breaking the tension with their cheerful greetings. They seemed blissfully unaware of the turmoil simmering beneath the surface, and I forced a smile, hoping they wouldn't see through it. My mom immediately launched into her plans for the day, a long hike through the nearby woods, followed by a picnic lunch by the lake. Normally, the idea would have sounded perfect, an escape into nature, but today, it felt like a challenge, like pretending everything was normal when nothing was. "Great idea, Mom," I said, mustering as much enthusiasm as I could. "A hike sounds nice." My stepbrother nodded in agreement, though his eyes lingered on me for a moment too long, as if trying to gauge my thoughts. I looked away, focusing on my coffee, hoping he wouldn't push any further. We spent the morning hiking along a narrow trail that wove through dense trees and patches of sunlight. My parents led the way, chatting about the wildlife and stopping occasionally to take photos. I trailed behind them, lost in my own world, trying to ignore the person walking just a few steps behind me. Every time I looked back, he was there, close enough that I could feel his presence, yet maintaining enough distance to avoid any direct interaction. The silence between us felt like an unspoken agreement, a way to keep the peace. As we reached a clearing, my mom spread out a picnic blanket and began unpacking the lunch. We settled down, and I tried to enjoy the moment, the simple pleasure of fresh air and good food. But even then, I couldn't escape the tension that followed me like a shadow. When lunch was over, my parents decided to explore a bit further down the trail, leaving the two of us behind to clean up. As they disappeared into the trees, I busied myself with gathering the plates and cups, focusing on the small tasks in the hope that they'd drown out my thoughts. But of course, he couldn't leave it alone. "Are you going to avoid me forever?" he asked quietly, his voice breaking through my attempts to ignore him. I froze, gripping the edge of the blanket, and took a steadying breath before turning to face him. "I'm not avoiding you," I said, though the words felt empty. "Then why won't you look at me?" His eyes held that familiar, unyielding gaze, searching for answers I didn't have. You act like what happened was a mistake, like it didn't mean anything. Because it shouldn't mean anything, I replied, the words coming out sharper than I intended. I looked away, staring at the trees as if they held some secret that could pull me out of this mess. We're here with our parents for a family trip. We can't, we can't keep doing this. He let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. But that's the thing. I don't want to pretend it didn't happen. I don't want to just ignore it. Maybe you don't, I murmured, feeling the weight of his gaze. But I need to. A silence settled between us, and I could feel his frustration, the tension simmering beneath his calm exterior. But he didn't press me further, and for a moment, I thought maybe he'd finally let it go. As we packed up the rest of the picnic, my parents returned, oblivious to the charged atmosphere that hung between us. My mom commented on the beauty of the trees, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the ground. I nodded along, feigning interest, but my thoughts were miles away, tangled in everything I couldn't say. The hike back was a blur. I kept my head down, focusing on the path ahead, letting the steady rhythm of walking numb the storm of emotions inside me. When we finally reached the cabin, I felt a wave of relief, grateful to be back in a place where I could retreat to my own space. But as the day faded into evening, that sense of relief turned into something heavier, a weight pressing down on me. The unspoken words, the unresolved tension, all of it circled back, refusing to be ignored. I sat alone by the window, watching as the sky turned shades of pink and orange, the sun dipping below the horizon.